Thanks to everyone for joining us both in person here in the room and also online. And now you can finally see us, so we're happy for that. My name is Gordon Gray. I'm the Quake Professor of Gulf and Arabian Peninsula Affairs and the Director of the Middle East Policy Forum. And events by the forum are made possible by generous support from ExxonMobil. So I want to thank them for their continued support for the program, and also want to thank you, Christian, and you, Logan, for all your hard work in getting this together. Before we turn to today's topic, I just want to talk about our next, give a heads up about our next two events. At the end of January, Tuesday, January 27th, Washington Post columnist Shadi Hamid will talk about his new book, The Case for American Power. That'll be right here in this room. And 2 weeks after that, February 10th, also Tuesday, Professor Sina Zodi will moderate a panel with other Iran experts on the eve of the anniversary of the Iranian revolution. Turning to today's topic, Dr. Dalia Dassa Kaye has written a critical analysis of the U.S.-Iranian relationship, and she focuses in her book on the making U.S. policy toward Iran since the Reagan administration. And you really had tremendous access, so made the book really interesting. The number of people she interviewed, both on the record and on background. Professor Zodi will give a better, more complete introduction, maybe a better one too, of Dr. Kaye and of the book. And no one's better suited to give the introduction than you, not just because of your YouTube capabilities, but also being a two-time Elliott School alumnus. Professor Zodi also got his doctorate from the University of South Florida, and he's director of the Middle East Studies program, and frequently interviewed by the media want to know what's going on in Iran. And his book is Iran and the Bomb, United States, Iran and the Nuclear Question, will be published in the summer. For those of you who like to plan ahead, mark your calendars for Tuesday, September 15th, when we'll have his book launch. In the meantime, you can get copies of this book right out here from the campus bookstore selling them, and I encourage you to do so. So, Zina, over to you. Dalia, thanks so much for coming.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so okay, should I do it from here or down?
You do.
Okay, I'll just sit here. Why not? Very comfortable. Well, it's great to be back. Thank you for hosting me, Ambassador Gray and Sina, Professor Zodi. It's just really nice to be back at GW. To be honest, it just was such a treat to have lunch with students here just before this. I was a professor here myself, my very first job. Nathan Brown can testify to this. Back in the day, right out of grad school, and I see that it's only improved since. So it really feels like coming home, so it feels very appropriate to be sharing this new book with this audience. And all the power to the next generation of thinkers on these issues. So thanks for coming. So what I'm going to do, I think the idea for today is that I'm going to give a few initial remarks, and then we're going to open it up for some dialogue, and then some questions for the audience. So, and I also should just briefly note that that I started this book at the Wilson Center, and we have former Wilson leadership here, so thanks for coming, Rob. And it just shows how important universities and research institutions are to these kinds of conversations. So it's really a pleasure to finally have this between covers, because I did start it during the pandemic and then got a little distracted, but finally finished it. So here we are. I'm sorry that right before the holidays, I don't have a happier topic. It is not a happy story, so I will warn everybody about that, although I think it will try to end where there may be openings
Sure.
and different ways forward in the future. And really, I wrote this book because I have long been focused on how you resolve conflicts, how you deal with former adversaries. My initial career started focused more on Israel-Palestinian issues. And when I moved to California and started at the RAND Corporation, a think tank based in Santa Monica, headquartered at least, it was right after the Iraq War, and there was a lot of focus on the role of Iran in the region. It wasn't supposed to be that way. In fact, many policymakers in Washington thought once the U.S. invaded Iraq that dominoes would fall and Iran would be next and everything would be solved in the Middle East. And before I go into the details of this book, just one cautionary note to especially you students. If any professor says there's this one way to solve the Middle East conflict, whatever it is, U.S.-Iran, Israel-Iran, Israel-Palestine, no. There is never one simple solution. It is a complicated region. Our policies are complicated, and nuance is what brings understanding and hopefully us closer to solving conflicts. So what really struck me and what drove me is also the heart of the questions of this book. And so what I'll do is I'll lay out some of the key questions first, then a couple of the key arguments, central themes of the book, a few historical examples, although we can go more in our discussion, and then just, some of the takeaways from it. So starting with the puzzle of this, and one of the things I want to understand is, here we are, we're sitting in 2025. When I wrote it, wasn't quite that far along, but we're over 4 decades into a very hostile relationship with this country. Since the Islamic Republic in 1979 was founded, we have now been in a Cold War of sorts. Policies of containment, isolation, and pressure have pretty much prevailed as the policies of choice when it comes to Iran. So we're now actually in a state of hostility with this country for longer than the U.S.-Soviet Cold War. So it's quite remarkable. And what puzzled me is, how have we been able to overcome animosity with many other adversaries in the world? Even with the Soviets, during the Cold War, we were having talks on arms control, which we have achieved with Iran. We'll get to that, but much more transformative talks and longstanding. We had embassies. We've, overcome, relations and hostility to restore diplomatic ties with countries like Cuba and Libya. Again, those all have their own, but something about Iran is like in a league of its own. And the hostility has lasted a very, very long time. We haven't had like a Nixon goes to China moment when it comes to U.S.-Iran. There were moments, and the book talks about a lot of them, where things might have been different. There were moments when the temperature was lowered, whether it was in response to leaders within Iran that rose, that were deemed more pragmatic, or own different priorities at home and pressures. So that it's not to say it has only been containment and there hasn't been any talks, but more often than not, the policy defaulted to pressure, containment, economic isolation, and so forth. And the thing that bothered me was that we kept this policy going for all of these decades, and yet we have suboptimal results. We continue to be back where we're on the brink of war, where we're continuing to do all this bad stuff to each other, and it's the people who suffer the most at the end of the day, right? We have to, it's not just an enduring hostility, but we all have to endure it and have endured it. And so I was interested in why you see interest, administration after administration, to try to come up with maybe a more rational approach, a different way. And every time it fails. Even the brief kind of period in the Iran nuclear deal talks with maybe you as students, I think some of you were in Iran at the time, were students in Iran. That didn't last long. It didn't prove as transformative as hoped. So the question really is, why has it persisted so long? So the book gets to this question, and the obvious answer, which it addresses, which is it's Iran, obviously. And that has been the prevailing answer in Washington for many years, not in every quarter, but in many. And it's basically, like Bill Clinton, if you're old enough to remember Bill Clinton. Yeah, he was our president, 2 terms. And so, he used to say, or one of his advisors used to say, it's the economy, stupid, like that's why, that's what's going to win us the ticket, which it did. I like to say the common answer to this, why this hostility has endured so long, is it's Iran stupid. Iran does a lot of bad things. And the book takes this as a baseline assumption. Iran is up to a lot of nasty behavior, starting with the hostage crisis in 1979, where they took our U.S. diplomats for 444 days, to the Marine barracks bombings in Beirut in 1983, to the Khobar Tower bombing in the 90s, to killing American military personnel after the Iraq War, when we invaded the country, when we thought it was going to fall, but it didn't. And guess what? Iran actually became more influential. And we had a lot of military guys on the ground that were kind of sitting ducks for a lot of the militia forces supporting by Iran. The list goes on and on up until the June tit for tat, our attack on Iran, and then the response. But of course, the escalation you saw from the Gaza war starting in October 23 on. Attacks in the oil arena. This is an ongoing issue. It's actually not just an issue that started with the Houthis attacking tankers in the Red Sea before and after, especially after the October attacks in 23, but actually you had ongoing maritime conflict between the Iranians and the Americans from the 1980s. You had a tanker war. You had a lot of conflict from the very earliest moments of the revolution in Iran. So Iran has done all these bad things. They've also, not to mention all the repression within its own country, against its own people. The list goes on and on. The thing is, this story, it's not to say we shouldn't appreciate the story and understand this story. It's real. It's worrying. But the argument is it's not the only part of the story. Usually when a conflict can't be resolved, there are 2 parties that have to be looked at why this can't get resolved. And so the point of my book is to put a mirror up and say, okay, what about our side of the story? What is happening in Washington that is preventing, when there are moments when maybe we could start changing things? I'm not saying we're going to be friends. But what we could try to do is get to the point where we're normal adversaries. We're not even normal adversaries. It's like, again, this pariah state and so forth. So basically what I am arguing in this book is it's not just about the things Iran does. It's also about us. It's about both of us. And so what I do is I present an argument that ultimately is rooted in the domestic politics of the United States, but it goes beyond politics. It's also about the discourse and framing of Iran that has persisted from the very outset to this day, where I think words really matter. Leaders matter, how things are framed matter. And what I argue is that when you routinely label a country abnormal, outlaw, rogue, fanatical, evil, malign, whatever word you want to use of the day. Rogue is uncivilized. Okay. And they do all these things that fuel those framings, right? I'm not saying that's not existent, but you use that discourse again and again, and it raises the cost. First of all, it gets, in some policymakers' minds, becomes reality. They're a pariah. We can't deal with them. Also, because they're uncivilized mad mullahs, they will never change. The foundation of the Islamic Republic is fundamentally anti-West, anti-American especially, right? It was founded on that. They have their own list of grievances. That's another book that maybe you're working on. But the point being is that we frame this country, when you look at a country like this, unchangeable, it's not just that the political costs are higher because, wow, what policymaker would deal with such an evil state? Then you must be an apologist for the regime, or you're acting out of weakness, and you look like what appeasement. You're appeasing, but it's also, well, why expend the political cost, even if you think they're rational and maybe would respond, and you don't like the outcomes you're getting, and you argue for a different way. If you never think they're going to change, then why make the effort? And so we see this again and again. And what's really interesting, what I do in this book, is we talk often, and maybe if you're taking the professor's course, you're learning about all the factional debates going on in Iran itself. And Iran is a super complicated country. I am not an domestic Iran expert. I leave that to others. Yeah, it's a very, very hard country to decipher. And most Iranians I know themselves, even ones who still can go back and forth, still can't figure out how that system works. It's very complex. We do know it's not a democracy. It is authoritarian, but it has interesting elements. The point being is that when you consistently frame a country like this, it gets very, very difficult to look for different ways. So oftentimes we're seeing these factions in Iran, who hardliners, reformists, pragmatists, and that's kind of explaining what's happening. Hardliners are always winning. What I do in the book is I give an overview of our own factional debates, right? So I give an overview of factional debates in Washington and the push and pull among elements, even though the overall discourse is one of hostility and so forth, behind the scenes, there are a lot of policymakers who are actually debating and discussing, maybe we should normalize relations. Maybe this isn't so bad. In fact, even right after the revolution, very early on, even in the Carter days, before the hostages were released, you have interesting cables that have now been declassified, showing that, Warren Christopher and others in the Carter administration were talking about, well, maybe once they release the hostages, we can consider a more, appropriate or correct course, I think was the word they used with Iran. So even with the trauma of the hostage crisis, there was already interest in, can we do something different? And up to this day. And the factional fights can be intense. I interview many policymakers for this book, some on the record, some not, as the ambassador mentioned. Ryan Crocker went on the record, and he has some really interesting stories. He'll be with me in a panel tomorrow. Just about after the 2003 war, for example, when there was really very strenuous internal divisions in the government between neocon factions and those who were interested in dealing with the Iranians, because after the fall, this was actually before 2003 Iraq war, but with the fall of the Taliban after 9/11 and the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, Iran and the United States actually had some common interest when it came to Afghanistan. The Taliban were perceived as a common enemy. Don't forget, Al-Qaeda was behind 9/11. It's a Sunni extremist group. So it's not that Shia Iran all of a sudden was looking moderate, and I don't like to overplay the sectarianism business, by the way, but that is a big framing as well. So there was a sense that we could work with the Iranians, and there were diplomats like Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who actually was one of the first U.S. diplomats to engage in direct talks with the Iranians since the revolution. And, he told me stories of how he had to fly out on a Friday night, after the close of business day, and come back Sunday night, meet the Iranians in, Switzerland, wherever, neutral place that they could manage to meet, and get back by Sunday night, so that the other faction in Washington, completely adamantly opposed to any engagement with the Iranians, because they thought the Iranian regime would fall. That was the solution. Keep the pressure on. No diplomacy. Diplomacy was bad. And he would have to try to hide it. And he didn't even put things on paper because there was so much infighting. It turns out that on another one of these missions, Jim Dobbins is another U.S. diplomat who did some of this engagement. It turns out he learned years later in another one of these jostling incidents that he learned from a memoir of I think it was Tenet's memoir, that actually some of the guys who were trying to torpedo his diplomacy with Iran in the administration actually went to Rome to meet Iranian dissidents. So they were trying to create a back channel to kind of work on regime change. It got shut down ultimately, but it just shows you the back and forth that happens within our own government. So essentially, because I'm going to shorten my remarks because I really want to do the engagement, essentially my story is about our debates, our conflict within Washington, the way in which the framing made it so much harder for the pro-diplomacy, pro-engagement side to ultimately win the day. And that's why we see policies continuing to look the same again and again with slight detours. I liken it to like bends in a river going in one strategic direction, which is why here we are in 2025, and we still, are on potentially the brink of another war. I mean, President Trump says that nuclear sites were obliterated in June. But from other people I talked to, it does not seem like the story is necessarily over. So that's really what the book is about. I think that I could go through all of the historical things, but I'm not going to do that now. Only to say that in every historical era, and the book is kind of lumped by historical era, you can make a rational strategic case. This is where I'm going to put my poli-sci hat on, realism versus leaders and so forth. You can make a very Waltzian strategic case, balance of power, blah, blah, blah. You can see where I sit on that whole, I haven't done theory in a while, but you can see where I sit. Because I think ideas and people really matter. Narratives matter. Discourse matters. But you can make a rational case strategically that it did not make any sense to keep up this conflict with Iran. In the Cold War, there was interest in isolating and keeping the Soviets out of the region, which would have suggested more engagement with Iran. Every single period after the end of the Soviet Union, the U.S. was predominant. There was not a huge threat from Iran at that time. There was a President Rafsanjani at the time who was looked at as a more moderate actor. And President Bush at that time, the first President Bush, thought about engagement, talked about maybe goodwill begets goodwill in a speech. Then you have after the Afghanistan 9/11 attacks, a more common denominator. Every single era, and then great power competition. You can make a great case with all the fatigue of U.S. engagement in the Middle East and all these wars that led to this is across the spectrum in Washington, really, the sense of all of this investment in Middle East wars, and what have we to show for it? So I think in every era you can make a strategic case, and yet transformational change did not happen. Generally, we have this continuum. Sure, you can say, and Iran did a lot of things to disrupt it over time, right, when there were openings, but a lot of it is about the psyche in Washington, the discourse in Washington, the leaders who ultimately prevailed, and the inability to start thinking in more creative ways and limiting options because of that discourse. So I think I'm going to end there. I just want to say, and we could get into this in Q&A, I do consider Israel in the book. I often get this question. And, isn't Israel, just like, isn't Iran? Again, this is like the single answer response. Why is there this? And it's like one answer. It's Iran. It's Israel. And in the book, I argue, no, it's not Israel. It's actually very homegrown. Now, Israel plays a disproportionate, probably largest role in terms of the thinking of American policymakers, especially in Congress. And in the book, I go through lots of examples of that. But it is interesting if you look at the empirical record, which, as researchers we should do, and be honest about it. On many occasions, most eras really, you can find instances where U.S. policy actually departed from what the Israeli preference was at the time. The most dramatic example was the 2015 nuclear deal, where there was the most high-profile attempt by the Israeli government, the Prime Minister himself, Netanyahu, coming to the U.S. Congress, arguing against the policy of a sitting President of the United States without even being invited by that president to come, trying to undercut his policy. So you can't get a more forceful public opposition to a U.S. policy, which was interested in trying to at least contain the nuclear problem. It wasn't going to solve everything, but contain the nuclear. And it didn't work. At the end of the day, it didn't work. Israel did not win that battle. Okay, so I have a bunch of other examples like that. But just to maybe conclude before we continue the discussion on a slightly more hopeful note, I don't know if it's more hopeful, but I mean, one of the lessons of this is obviously change is hard. Okay, and people in this room, you probably study many foreign policy issues, not just Middle East ones. U.S. foreign policy often is policy inertia is a real thing. It's very, very difficult to change policies. It's often not viewed as beneficial for careers. It's, as we talked about in terms of the discourse on many issues, especially with adversaries. Iran isn't alone on this. There are always concerns about being vulnerable to accusations of appeasement and so forth. So it's really difficult to change course, especially with a country as difficult as Iran. But there is, I think, hope in that you see examples where unfortunately, it's often after conflicts and bad things happen because that tends to force thinking, right? When we're like, well, maybe this isn't working so well. But there are moments where it can be possible to start saying, maybe we can at least lower the temperature. And this isn't hypothetical. You started to see elements of this even before, right before October 2023. The Biden administration, even though I have a chapter about how actually they were not too enthusiastic about returning, as you would have thought based on Biden's campaign rhetoric, they did not return to the nuclear deal with the force that one would have expected given the rhetoric. In fact, there was the chapters called Death by Slow Walking. Biden administration really miscalculated, took their time, thought they had more leverage than they did, absolutely blew back, and we know the story ever since. It hasn't gotten better. But there was a moment right before where there was an attempt to deal with the Iranians, and it was potentially going to go back to direct diplomacy, because ultimately, if we're going to resolve this, we have to get back to talking directly. And it wasn't going to solve everything, but they were going to have some kind of partial de-escalation. At least don't attack each other, right? Stop with the direct attacks, the sabotage, transnational repression. That's going to be harder, but at least stop attacks on American forces, and the U.S. could guarantee it won't be attacking Iran. That would be very much a possibility now, post the June war, if we can get to some kind of non-aggression type of stance. I think detente is possible with the Iranians. It's time, because we all have paid too big of a price, the people first and foremost, especially within Iran. It's a very important country. You teach on it. And it's a country, if we change this relationship with Iran, and my belief is engagement could actually, we know regime change doesn't work well. Engagement could give us a better chance of hopefully Iran changing. Because let's face it, we do want a different kind of country in Iran. It could really change the face of the Middle East. If you really de-escalate U.S.-Iran tensions, it would be a game changer. I'm not saying the only one. I'm not contradicting myself. It's not the only thing. You're going to have to deal with Israel-Palestine. You're going to have to deal with a lot of other issues. But it would be a big one. It's a big source of instability that has not just affected us and Iran. It's affected the entire world. And we're 46 years into this. It's time to finally figure out a different path forward. It won't be easy, and that's why my book is about the enduring part, but I hope it becomes more history than future in the years ahead. So that's kind of an outline of what the book is about, and I hope you have a chance to read it. Oh, and by the way, I know there's some books out there for sale. I'm not trying to discourage buying there, but
please do.
Please do. But there is, Stanford University Press is having a cyber special week. So since it's holiday time and special, I think it's 40% off this week. So check that out. So it's not expensive. Okay.
Dalia, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Let me first apologize. At 2:15, I need to put on my running shoes, as Ambassador Gray said, and run to my other class, which starts at 2:20. So I apologize in advance if I leave early. But I do want to ask you, this is, by the way, this is a fascinating work, and this is something that I also discuss in my classes, about othering of the people that you don't like.
Yeah.
And this doesn't just apply to Iran, it applies to Russia. Putin is crazy, he's irrational. Kim Jong-un is crazy, he's irrational. Can you tell us, you discussed it briefly, can you tell us more about this othering? That we are civilized, we're good, the other side is bad, barbaric, uncivilized, their deterrence doesn't apply to them. So they have to be like us to act normal, right? So could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, I think, you see it over and over again. You see it especially in congressional discourse, right? Where because politically it's kind of it's not really a political winner to be like, well, maybe there are Iranians who are reasonable, given that there are assassinations and it's hard to do that, right? So I understand so there is a basis for it. But it does penetrate the wider kind of American public because it's not just in government, it's also in our think tanks and our media system. It kind of, I think, seeps in to kind of a general way of looking at a country, and that makes it very hard because there is a good case to be made, that Iran is very dangerous country. Its leaders are doing, many of its leaders are doing dangerous things. But they are ultimately doing it for their own interest and their own rational, whether we like the reasons or not. And many of them are directly opposed to what we think are in the U.S. interest. But there's a logic to it, right? They're the ones being surrounded by the U.S., let's say especially after 2003, but U.S. force presence in the Middle East increases significantly by the early 2000s. They're the ones that are looking out and saying talk of regime change and so forth. And some of the ideological components, which you know better than me, of the revolution are not maybe, you could argue that's a lot less rational, just being anti-U.S. for anti-U.S. without, But of course they have the grievance from the coup, and there's lots of controversy and things written on that. In 1953, the U.S. helped support a coup overturning the democratically elected government in Iran with the British, and there's a lot of debate on the U.S. role versus domestic reasons for that. But let's just say the narrative there prevails that the U.S. is a big part of why Iran got the Shah and many years of repression, and that there is no democracy in Iran, which most Iranians, and rightly so, believe they deserve and should hopefully one day have a democratic Iran. So I think, part of it is just, it gets talked about at all levels and in all parts of the system in the U.S. That said, and that's what's so interesting about how that's so strong, you still have people in government, Ambassador Gray, you know this well, you're in the State Department, there are a lot of smart people in government. So this book is not just like bashing U.S. government, government policy. I mean, there are a lot of thoughtful people who were trying to improve things. And there were a lot of thoughtful people over the years who said, maybe we should think about this differently. And they did not consider the Iranians mad mullahs. They considered them rational. The problem is, they kept, and when you keep repeating it, it's almost like then becomes true by definition. That even those who thought it was rational kept thinking, yeah, they're rational, but the only way they'll really respond rationally is pressure. They won't understand, engagement will just be, if we give them any little bit, they're going to want more. So, for example, I was going to quote this in the talk, but if you hear this quote, this was an argument made, which you could say would be made yesterday. This was made by CIA Director William Casey in 1985. And he was trying to talk about, how to deal with the terrorism problem. We have to remember the main area of contention between the U.S. and Iran that gets a lot of attention is the nuclear, right? That's constantly in our headlines. And that was mostly starting from the early 2000s to the present day, when there was revealing of secret Iranian nuclear facilities, ongoing battles about will they weaponize or not weaponize, and we could talk about that more. But up until that point, and continuing to today, is the ongoing concern about Iranian support for terrorism. So CIA Director Casey says in 1985, quote, if the U.S. fails to respond to attacks by Iranian-sponsored groups, Iranian terrorism will continue and very likely grow. So it's this idea that if we don't respond with more pressure, military, economic, diplomatic isolation, it's only going to get worse because the Iranians will only be emboldened to keep doing more. So the dilemma becomes, regardless of what the Iranians are doing, when they're being more belligerent or less belligerent, because at times they themselves want to lower their temperature for their own reasons. But either way, we kind of say the same policies, we'll have to apply the same policies, because no matter what, either they're too crazy to respond, or if they're rational enough to respond, then we'll only embolden them further to do more bad stuff. So it's like there's no calibration in policy based on what they're saying from the other side. So that gets to the othering. What happens when you other somebody or an entity is that you keep thinking the same, you have to approach them the same way because they'll always be like that.
I'll add a small anecdote to it because I think it still matters. When Iranians and Americans first met in 2010 with Ambassador Burns, then State Department, and the head of the North American division of the Iranian Foreign Ministry, Ambassador Burns, and he's well-versed in everything international politics, he talks about the carrots and sticks policy, and he gives a lecture about a few minutes. But then the Iranian side, and he's the head of the North American division, he says, but your carrots and sticks are for animals.
Yeah.
We're not animals, we're humans.
I think he said for donkeys even, right?
Donkeys,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, except for donkeys.
Yeah.
Which I think is quite fascinating how like Iranians perceive themselves as coming from the US.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you, speaking of othering, because again, why do you think Obama was successful, whereas George H.W. Bush wasn't successful? He did say that goodwill begets goodwill,
Yeah.
but then he said that I only said goodwill, not good actions.
Yeah.
But Obama was successful in lowering the temperature. Can you tell us why? Why he was successful and the other ones were not?
Yeah. Good question. Well, it wasn't really given a lot of effort in HW beyond that opening. It didn't go very far, and part of it is I interviewed people like Richard Haas and everything. There wasn't a huge political appetite, again, because of the general context, and they had other priorities, right? That was the era where they were moving toward Arab-Israeli diplomacy after the first Gulf War in 1991. That was the Madrid Peace Conference and so forth. So this was an era where it was looked at as Iran was either viewed as something to just keep containing or just a sideshow. It wasn't really viewed as like, we really need to deal with this, except it was more tactical because that goodwill was more about getting the hostages out of Lebanon. So it was a much more tactical engagement. So I wouldn't have expected that to, I mean, when you look back at the record, so this is about, at the time, in the 80s, the first decade of the revolution, the Iranian leadership was very, very active. I'm sure you teach this in your class because the first decade of the revolution is really where the Iranians were most active in trying to export the revolution. Not very successfully. The best success was with Hezbollah, but there's a lot of reasons Iran is not as omnipotent as many believe. They had lots of weaknesses over the years. But in the 80s especially, they created Hezbollah. It's probably the closest militia to Iran ideologically. And these kinds of groups took a lot of hostages in Lebanon. And so throughout the 80s, there was a lot of focus on getting Americans hostages out of Lebanon. And this continued to be a big concern for HW. And so the goodwill is like, okay, release our hostages, maybe we'll give you sanctions relief. But unfortunately, the UN diplomat who tried to orchestrate that finally got the Iranians to help with getting the hostages out, but the Iranians did not, as you said, they didn't get the action they wanted. They didn't get the economic relief. And it just didn't go anywhere, partly because just other priorities. And same thing, what's the point? Yeah. They won't change. Why should we do it? Now, why was Obama different? Now, here I wouldn't exaggerate how different Obama was. I do think that the nuclear deal was the farthest the U.S. and Iran have ever gone. And the types of engagement that eventually transpired, where you see, I see John Kerry's photo in this room. I mean, John Kerry and foreign minister Zarif on the Iranian side, there were phone calls again. They were standing on the same stage. They were in meetings. It was very nascent, but it was becoming normal to use that word. We use abnormal all the time with Iran, but it's becoming normal to start having diplomatic engagement with Iran, and Iran was actually making good on containing its program, not to everyone's liking, and it was hugely contentious, and we don't want to get into the whole rehashing the JCPOA debate, but what's interesting about Obama is it got to that point, but Obama never looked at this as a transformative thing. Ultimately, it was an arms control agreement. Most of the people around Obama, even in the second administration, you see people like Nick Burns, people influential in Democratic Party circles. They were supportive of the Iran nuclear agreement, but they were not advocating for, okay, so now let's see if we can normalize ties with Iran. It was like, let's do the Iran deal, and now where can we hit them harder? In fact, we'll have to compensate for the Iran nuclear deal because we don't want to look too conciliatory. So we're going to have to do more sanctions on terrorism and more sanctions on repression and more sanctions on this and more sanctions is like the default policy in the United States, and as you say, many issues, because, we don't want to go to war. Diplomacy is Iran is a politically toxic issue, so diplomacy is hard, so you do the default. The last thing I'll say about Obama, so one is I'm not sure, it was a big deal, but not as, the other thing is, it took until Obama's second term. So I actually go through his first administration, his first administration, again, you could make the strategic, rational argument that, you know, he even talked about it. I have quotes in the book. I have it, bookmarked in mine, but I'll read it another time. But he talked about, you know, outstretched hand to Iran if Iran unclenches its fist. You know, he had very very Obama-like language, right? Coming in, I'm going to do big things. But at the end of the day, what happens in the first administration? Very quickly, the default is containment. He had a pretty hawkish foreign policy team in his first administration. In fact, Obama, in his own memoir, calls Hillary Clinton hawkish on Iran. And there's an excerpt that I have in the book where I interviewed Dennis Ross as well. And Dennis Ross, known to be on the more hawkish side, but by his telling is more of a dual track kind of guy. And Ross talks about a principals meeting, and he went on the record for this, about a principals meeting, meaning the president, the secretary of state, the highest levels of the government. And there was one principals meeting on Iran and whether maybe to start thinking about diplomacy and whether it would work or not. And this was very early on. And basically, the principals were trying to outdo the other on how tough they could look on Iran. Like, I think Hillary Clinton put it at like 10%. Oh, it will never work. And Obama himself didn't think it was going to work. So the first administration, and then, by the way, in 2010, you had the Stuxnet operation revealed, where the U.S. worked with Israel to sabotage Iranian centrifuges. So, I mean, it's not like we were doing all diplomacy. Other stuff is going on. Now, of course, if you care about nonproliferation, it's a good thing to set the Iranian program back. But doing it through sabotage that way, you're not exactly sending the message that diplomacy is the way forward. So actually, in the first administration, Obama was not that forthcoming. There is a lot of thinking that it did take to the second administration when he had a much freer political hand, right? He had, on your second term, you're not as constrained domestically and politically. That is a big part of the storyline. And again, people mattered. He had John Kerry replacing Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. John Kerry, for years, as Senate Foreign Relations Committee chair, had been engaging Iranians through track 1.5, back channel kinds of negotiations through, non-governmental organizations. These are very important kinds of dialogues that happen outside of formal channels. And this is where he met people like Zarif and so forth, and started to come up with the ideas that were the nascent ideas that led to the nuclear agreement. So people matter, ideas matter, political context matters.
I'm seeing a trend here because this is exactly what happened with Clinton when in his first administration, there's a lot of sanctions, pressure, containment, dual containment. But then when it comes to his second administration, you have a lot of engagement with Iran. The first time that Americans can go to Iran for studying Persian, academic exchanges, sports, athletic exchanges. For the first time, former Secretary of State Albright acknowledged the CIA coup in Iran, which was reciprocated by Iranians with Khatami apologizing for the hostage taking. Didn't apologize directly. So I'm seeing a trend here. So can we go back to your argument that this is domestic, that domestic political considerations stop engagement, that the president of the U.S. is mostly concerned about re-election than changing things?
Yeah, although I don't want to go too far that it's just about elections. I think it's so much deeper that. And I think that the context of the discourse raises the political cost. That's really the argument making, more than like a particular election moment. But there's no question you have more ability to push back against kind of the consensus discourse when you're not worried about re-election, right? Sure. But it also matters who's your advisors and who's trying to push things forward and new ideas forward. So Albright was more forthcoming. The first Clinton administration did not have. It was on the more, different side. And also, like HW, President Clinton was completely focused on Arab-Israeli. Everything for Clinton was about Israel and Arab-Israeli peace, right? This was the era of Oslo Accords. This was when I got interested. This is when I, as a very, I guess now in retrospect, naive student, believed there would be peace in the Middle East, right? I thought this is it. Finally, we're getting to, and this just tells you how bad things are often in the Middle East, where when I got to Iran in 2005 and all they want to do is focus on Iran and not Israel Palestine, I was like, oh, what a relief. Like, I can focus on Iran. That's such an easier issue. Now I found out not so easy. But yeah, so people really matter. So Albright was interested in testing, but also, and this is where you can't completely discount what's happening within Iran. You also have a more reformist president come to power in Iran in 1997. This is during Clinton's second term. And Khatami, the president, and this is, a big issue of, debate about who really calls the shots in Iran. The supreme leader, how much power does the presidents really have? They're elected. Supreme leader is obviously not. And so, the general consensus is you need the supreme leader's backing, but presidents can matter, right? And so, in terms of setting the context. So Khatami was talking about like dialogue of civilizations and, and so it was an easier environment for Albright to kind of try to build. But even then, we're talking like carpets and pistachios. there were some bigger things, but it wasn't easy. And I, in fact, interviewed Secretary Albright for the book before she passed away. And it was really interesting because she made a big deal about the speech. She gave this speech and she said it was so frustrating, though, because the Iranians, they really just focused on this like phrase, unelected leaders. That was because they had to put in some tough, again, this gets to the whole discourse, right? You can't give a speech in the U.S. on Iran unless you throw in some tough stuff, right? You can't just be all like, we're sorry. It has to be, but yeah, you did this and you did that and you guys aren't elected. Reminding them they're not democratic, which I think most Iranians most definitely know. And so anyway, she said she was frustrated by that, but she said she also found it hard when she spoke to Iranian diaspora groups. They were very upset with her, the ones she spoke to, because, they thought this isn't going to work, right? Why are you dealing with them all? Like, support us, the dissidents, we want to overthrow. So she said that made signal catching really hard, right? She had this domestic constraint. I will say, and I get back to the Iranian diaspora topic in a later chapter, because it really, I've said this to many people, it deserves a book of its own. It's a short section in Trump because actually, interestingly, the Trump administration, for very different reasons, actually probably tapped into the diaspora much more effectively than any other Democratic leader has. Mostly to tap into the hawkish components of the community who were very opposed to engagement. But the Iranian diaspora is actually quite diverse. It's not a monolithic grouping. It has a lot of different elements. There's generational differences, demographic, lots of different interesting nuances in that community. So arguing, Iranian diaspora is a domestic constraint on ever engaging with Iran, I think is misguided. And in fact, with the JCPOA, the majority of Iranian, when you look at polling, there's some non-governmental Iranian American organizations that do good public opinion polling of the Iranian community. I think it was something like 70% of Iranians actually supported Obama's policies. They supported the deal in those days. That was probably the heyday. Now there's not a lot of support because there's not much belief it's going to make a difference. But anyway, it's very divided. So yeah, I think that's part of the domestic story is a big part of the Clinton. But it's also, again, some of the personalities really matter.
There's an episode that you mentioned in the book with Albright confusing Zarif with the foreign minister, and she makes it into, she wants to make a joke that, we were both ambassadors and now we're foreign ministers. It turns out that it was not the Iranian foreign minister.
Yeah.
Which tells you so much how we, in the U.S., we are not in touch with who's even in power in Tehran.
Yeah. I think it's gotten better since then, but it's a really, it may not be, actually. Who knows right now? But honestly, it is a very telling anecdote because, this is when, again, it's not like we have never talked to the Iranians. When in this era, this was about, again, Afghanistan. It was a common area. There were multi-party talks. So the U.S. wasn't directly in a room only with Iranians. It was a multilateral UN-sponsored kind of thing. So kind of like a mini UN. So they're in the same room. But she was excited because she wanted to do engagement and thought, finally, I'm going to get to meet the foreign minister of Iran. This is going to break new ground. And it was the deputy, but she passed like a note to her assistant.
Is this the guy?
Is this him? Because he doesn't look like the picture I saw. Like, what's going on in real time in the meeting? And they're like, we don't know. So that's like the idea that the knowledge, and this is actually something that the second Bush administration, and critical in many ways, and Iraq, where I think was a huge mistake. But one thing they did improve, especially in the second administration of GW, was trying to get more understanding and access of what's happening within the country. So they started an Iran Watcher, kind of like a virtual embassy in Dubai. They expanded in the State Department, expertise, expanded Persian language. So I would only hope that after 20 years now of that kind of stuff going on, and from U.S. government people I meet now who focus domestically on Iraq, they really know, they do seem to know their stuff. But there's only so much you can know without being able to go to the country. And still, American officials cannot go to Iran. Iranian officials are limited to their, 3-5 square kilometer area in New York when they attend UN meetings. This is not normal. This is why we need to have, as I keep saying, normal adversarial relations. They're still our enemy. They're still an adversary. But we can deal with them as a normal adversary, not this very, I call it the perfect rogus, right? Because they have the Islamic angle, they have the violate international law angle, and it all merges into this most horrible, abnormal state that we can never do anything about. So having no contact is a big problem.
Moving on time. Another thing that I've noticed, it seems to me that the administrations in Tehran and Washington are not in sync. What I mean by that is that when the Americans reach out to Tehran, Iranians, we don't want to talk to you. But then when Iranians are ready to engage, there's this lingering problem in Washington that, now we don't want to talk to you anymore. So again, from Reagan to Iranians at that time with the a chocolate chip cookie and things like that, to Khatami trying to reach out to the Americans, Bush administration, Obama. So it seems to me that they're not in sync.
Yeah. No, it's a great point. I think in Obama, getting back to your earlier question, what made it different is it was more in sync then than it had ever been. But it really has to be in sync to get over the barriers on both sides, domestic. I think, this is why this is a good example of the issue now, because there is a debate ongoing in Iran at this moment, as I'm sure you're following. The resistance, Iran's support for the resistance, so-called resistance, all these groups fighting Israel and U.S. and so forth, it doesn't seem to have gone very well, right? I mean, this last couple years has not been very good for that camp. And so this is sparking, my understanding is it's sparking some debate in Iran, and maybe we need our own different way of looking at America. Like, how is this helping us? It doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight and so forth, but it started. And so the question is, will we be open to that? And so what you're seeing is maybe it was starting to be that way. We had 5 rounds of dialogue in Oman in April, and then we bombed the country. What message is that sending? So because the thinking in Washington is, okay, bomb, because then they'll come with a weaker hand and they'll be even more eager. And so again, every time we kind of go back to the default. And I won't say it's squandered yet, but there is kind of this belief in Washington, well, now they'll just capitulate, so it'll be easier. We'll be on the same page because we won and they lost. Well, my guess, I could be wrong, it'd be nice if I was wrong, but my guess is it's not going to work out that well. So I don't know if you share that. So that it's a constant problem, but part of my book is not just about why we always miss the opportunity. It's also why the opportunities are so hard to seize because of the dynamics here at home.
Okay, one last question, because I do want to open it to the public. Could you tell us more about the role of this career opportunities? People don't want to make change because they're concerned about their jobs, and special interest groups in DC that, at least during the implementation of JCPOA, worked overtime to hinder the implementation of the deal.
Yeah, there are lots of factors here. Let me get the latter one first. I mean, ultimately, I'm arguing against those interest groups ultimately affecting the policy, because if the political will of Washington is to do something else, they're not going to be able to overturn that. And they didn't, right? You didn't have as big of a campaign as you would have. It's hard to imagine a bigger campaign than what Netanyahu did in 2015, and it did not work. And then you could argue, well, in 2018, Trump left the nuclear deal, unilateral withdrawal from the deal. what I argue, and based on lots of discussions with people, it was a decision. It wasn't like the Israelis were lobbying for it. In fact, at that point, there were a number of Israelis who were opposed to the initial agreement, didn't think it did enough on missiles, on lots of other things, militia, so forth. But once the deal was in place and Iran was adhering to it based on international inspections and reports to the 3.67 cap, I mean, not perfect, but it was like, it was adhering to it. It was kind of working to contain it for the time that it was in place. And there were Israelis at that time who opposed the original one who said, we shouldn't overturn this. In fact, Trump had his own advisors early on in the first Trump administration, Jim Mattis, others who said, I don't like the deal either. I hate Iran, horrible, bad, evil state, all that. But, this is working, so we shouldn't do this. At the end of the day, Trump still withdrew, despite it. Netanyahu at that point is pushing on an open door. It's coming from Washington. In this case, President Trump himself, who is very driven by U.S. policy, as I talk about in the book, that's not a new thing. Domestic politics is part of the story all through. But, President Trump takes it to another level. For him, it's like, if I said I was going to do it on my campaign, this is what I'm doing. He was absolutely adamant. If Obama's going to do something, I'm doing the opposite. It called it the Obamacare. It became the Obamacare foreign policy, right? Overturning the Iran deal. It was a passion. It was a mission. He was determined to get out of this deal, regardless of the input he was getting from Israel anyway. Now, Israel has the most influence out of probably any of our regional partners in the Middle East on discourse in Washington. Increasingly, the Gulf states are having more influence. And that gets the second point about careerism and so forth. Now the Gulf states have kind of calmed things down with Iran, and so they're actually pro-diplomacy, which is a good thing. This could be something we could capitalize on. But at the time of the Iran nuclear deal, they did not like it. It was reversed. And they fund a lot of the think tanks in Washington and so forth. So I'm not saying there's a direct correlation, but there is, I wouldn't say, a strong incentive system in Washington to be tough on Iran. If you think you might want an ambassador post like 3 years later and you have to go through a confirmation hearing and they're going through your files and they said, oh yeah, we should, have diplomacy with Iran, you could get burned. Yeah. So there's a lot of self-censorship. There's a lot of, just being careful in language, which you do. Because what are you going to win? What are you going to win by advocating for engagement with Iran in our system? Not a lot. So I discussed that in the final chapter, and it's not just an Iran issue, it's a broader U.S. foreign policy issue. It's come up a bit with U.S. China and so forth. So I think there's some broader lessons we can take from it as well.
Great. All right, I'm going to open it up to Q&A. If you have questions, raise your hand, introduce yourselves. Yes, Amir.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Amir. I go to school here at Elliott. I'm a master's student. I was actually curious, you talked briefly about the diaspora. And I've seen and I've read and I've heard a lot of interesting things about the diaspora. I was wondering if you could go into more about how the diaspora influences policymaking in DC, or if it's sort of like the other way that policymaking uses the diaspora for different things. We have Reza Pahlavi, who sort of feels like a sports team mascot more than a serious, genuine political actor, but that he goes to events and stuff. I was curious about that aspect.
Great question. I think it's more the latter. I think Washington uses the diaspora at times more effectively than not. As I said, President Trump was actually very good at this. Secretary of State Pompeo at the time in the first administration. Not now, we're not saying it. In fact, I don't know how the diaspora is feeling about the second Trump administration, because the main thing they did when it came to Iranians living in America is they sent a plane load of Iranians back based on this anti-immigration business, and a horrific deal they made with the Iranians. I'd like to see more positive deals with the Iranians, but this is not the kind of negotiation you want, where they send Iranians back who most definitely will face persecution when they do not want to go back to Iran, will likely dissidents who are likely going to face persecution. So human rights is not exactly very high on the agenda of this administration. And human rights and democracy is like the most important issue for the diaspora. But in the first administration, the administration was very good at tapping into especially the more hawkish elements to argue for a pressure campaign. Maximum pressure was the term used and so forth. And they did a lot of engagement with the diaspora. So again, I think it's more tapping in than the diaspora affecting. It's just already taking like-minded beliefs. And made an effort when they would go to California, give speeches in the Nixon Library, would invite a large contingent of Iranian Americans of certain persuasion there and so forth. The Biden administration did not do that. I've had Iranian Americans tell me, it's interesting. Democrats tend to be very sheepish about engagement with Iranian Americans because it's such a politically toxic issue. They're even more scared of touching it. Like it's such a political football, they just don't want to touch it. So it's more the latter case, and a lot of Iranian Americans I've talked to also have described, again, I really think you students should think about it, especially if you think about a doctorate, really deserves a book. This is a very rich research area, and in general, how diasporas affect policy. It's a very interesting question, not just the Iranian. But I think that the question of influence is interesting because a lot of Iranian Americans I've talked to have kind of lamented, why don't we have more influence? There's I've seen estimates of up to 2 million Iranian Americans. Is that right?
Close to it.
I've seen estimates from 500,000 to 2 million. But it's a pretty sizable diaspora, very prominent, professionally doing very well, educated. I mean, it's like considered very important group. And I've talked to many who lament that why don't we have power like the Israeli lobby? Like, why aren't we doing what Israel? Like, why is this? Like, Iran's an important country. We're important people, and we've established. A lot of Iranian Americans for many years were very, and maybe to this day, most likely, especially right now, very hesitant to get into politics or anything policy oriented. They just want to do their thing, be successful, doctors, lawyers, engineers, succeed in the American system, not touch policy. But a lot of Iranian Americans have said, given all these policies are affecting us, like our families can't visit us, they're not getting the health care they need in Iran, these sanctions are hurting our families, maybe we should, the repression in Iran, nobody in Washington seems to care about that. Maybe we should have more influence. So I've heard a lot of the community say, why aren't we more organized? So that could change in the future, but up until now, they have not been a very significant influence on policy.
You say that detente is still possible, and I was wondering, given that a lot of Americans condition engagement on the nuclear issue, how, especially in recent events where it's become a lot more of a problem, and many people believe that Iran is more likely to keep its nuclear arms or capabilities. How do you get over that hurdle to reach detente, or are you able to go around it?
Yeah.
How would you?
It's a very important point. And there's no easy answer. The nuclear issue, as I said, since the early 2000s has been one of the huge sticking points. And there was a way to deal with it back in, when we had the deal in place. Now that it's unraveled and basically the Iran deal is dead. And as you say, after the June attack, there are arguments in Iran. You're hearing more open discussion about, well, maybe that's why we need a nuclear weapon, right? It's only incentivizing the idea that maybe we should weaponize our civilian program for a deterrent because, look at Ukraine. They gave up weapons, they got attacked. Countries that didn't give up their weapons don't seem to get attacked. So there is that kind of logic. I still think there's a strong incentive in Iran. We'll have to see. The answer is I don't know. It could be it will be too big of a hurdle. I think there are reasons why weaponizing is still a very dangerous course for Iran to take. It opens itself up to more scrutiny, more attacks, and so forth. Also, just so much domestic socioeconomic pressures, climate. We were just talking earlier at lunch, Iranian students can't go to school because of pollution. I mean, these are really big problems. So, that debate in Iran about where to be putting your resources could sway that. So I don't think it's mission impossible. A lot will depend on how the Iranians are looking at things. Of course, Washington has to stop thinking bombing is the only way to solve this problem. That's going to help. So my view is maybe we just try to de-escalate tensions at a political level, get to some kind of non-aggression, and then you can have more sane discussions about how to contain the nuclear. So far, we've been doing nuclear first, and then maybe other stuff will follow, and that hasn't worked very well. So I'm just brainstorming. Maybe we should think about other ways of trying to get at this.
Question, and then another question. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for being here, Dr. Kaye. It was really insightful, and I look forward to reading your book about the pivotal historical moments that the United States could have probably capitalized on. My question for you is if you could touch a little bit about the role that oil politics plays in engagement with Iran, particularly with either their unwillingness or willingness to the way that they price oil, supply it, and other similar accommodations to the United States compared to, I guess, how Saudi Arabia has been in that relationship. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about oil.
Yeah, well, oil is, people have written books about oil in the Middle East. It's obviously a big factor. I think it's less on oil supply. It does affect diplomacy because or incentives on our side to keep tensions down a little bit because Ukraine affected this quite a bit because Ukraine constrained the amount of oil on the market from losing Russia's supply. So there was more thinking of we need the Iranians to keep pumping, so maybe we'll do some sanctions waivers and look the other way. So that's had an impact. But I think, the main factor of oil, so there is some of that. And for Iran, sanctions relief is so important. Mostly exporting its oil is the key. It needs banking and so forth. But one of the reasons it lashed out so much after 2018, when the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear agreement, was it wasn't just pulling out of the agreement, it was also this maximum pressure campaign, which was all about stopping Iranian oil exports, right? It tried to squeeze Iran to zero. And it was it wasn't effective at solving the problem because we want to solve the problem, we want Iran to be less aggressive. Unfortunately, after the Trump administration did that, Iran got more aggressive and started hitting oil tankers and facilities by 1 year later in 2019 in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. So this has been, the oil factor is huge. So any kind of agreement is going to have to deal with how to allow Iran to export its oil in a way that was, considered as part of some kind of agreement, sanctions relief kind of agreement for curtailing other problematic areas that we and others don't like. And the other thing I would say about oil is it has been a big weapon that the Iranians have used over time, sometimes more than less. But it's been a constant threat that if you hit us, they've tried to use it. If you strike us too hard, they're on the Strait of Hormuz, strategically located. We don't have a map up here, but we're going to close off the supply. Like we can threaten, and they have done that, and the Houthis have done it, which they have supported. So it's kind of a lever the Iranians have. Now, it only goes so far because if you cut off all the oil, they don't make money either, right? So it's self-defeating. So it's not that simple, but it is something the Iranians have used over time as kind of, so it is the oil 100% plays a factor, is a factor in it. Ultimately, I don't think it's the source of why we haven't resolved. It's more of a tactical question of how it will be dealt with.
Okay. Last question, and you brief.
So you touched on this a bit when you referred to the nuclear deal, but how much influence do you think Israel and Benjamin Netanyahu have, particularly on our current administration's policy towards Iran, where you saw this summer kind of what seemed like the U.S. following Israel's lead and attacking Iran?
Yeah. Well, I think, okay, first of all, it's hard to know what internal dynamics went out there. There is a case to be made that, Trump likes success. So it's not 100%. For sure, the Israelis wouldn't have been able to do the attack without the U.S. saying, okay, there's no way they did it behind the back of the administration. Whether the U.S. was planning the whole time to launch the attack, there certainly had been preparation for it, no question. There are arguments that President Trump liked success, and when he saw it was kind of working, why not get in on the game and claim, and then the reverse, like when it started to be diminishing returns, he's like, no. So it's very hard to know, but I would say that more often than not, the U.S. is the one kind of guiding it. I mean, look at the record of Trump's, for everyone thinks, oh, Trump wants peace in the, he doesn't want wars. But if you look at his first administration, he was not adverse to military conflict. And in fact, he's the one who made the decision to kill General Soleimani, Qasem Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, the very dangerous, Revolutionary Guards force that, helps train a lot of militias all around the region. And so that was a major decision. U.S. killed Soleimani in Iraq, not in Iran. So this was taking it to a next level to actually attack Iran itself, was crossing another major red line. But this has not been a president averse to military forces. Many administrations before he considered it and rejected it. So yes, while President Trump talks about wanting a deal, he sends a lot of mixed messages. So did he come in saying, I'm going to attack Iran? The war plans were there. If you look at the first administration, he was infatuated with war plans against Iran. So yes, the Israelis have wanted to do it a long time, but they wouldn't do it without American backing. So I think it's not just like a simple, the Israelis say it, so you do it. No, a lot of it is happening in terms of our own context here. So that's how I'm reading it anyway.
Okay, thank you so much.
It was really a pleasure. Thank you.